Welcome everybody to this session on. Welcome everybody to this session on the Quebec's Climate Change Committee on and a special attention, special focus, of course, on transportation and decarbonization. We will first have a brief presentation from Benoit Rigaud, the Secretary of the Committee, and then we are going to hear from Catherine and on transportation in Quebec in general, and then from Annie Levasseur on land use planning. So the committee has several reports. And one of the reports we're going to present today is this one on land use planning and architecture. And then we're going to end the session with my own presentation, which is on heavy goods transportation, freight transportation in Quebec. A report that's due out soon. So without further ado, as the formula wants, I'm going to yield to Benoit, who's going to present what is the committee in Quebec and what is it doing. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. So my name is Benoit Rigaud. I'm the secretary of this committee. Thank you for being here this morning. I will give you a general presentation of our committee. It will be in 3 steps. First of all, I will put Quebec's committee within an international perspective. It's important to mention that what we are doing with this committee in Quebec is within an international trend about the creation of independent committee in the world. Secondly, I will give you some formal informations about our committee, its membership, its mission, for example. And so in a third time, I will present you our work about carbon neutrality, which was our first advice, which has been published in 2021. So, what is important to say in the first step is that when we are working on transparency, accountability, and the place of science in policy making, one of the innovation we have to do, institutional innovation we have to do, is to create such an independent body composed of independent researchers and experts. It has many advantages. It provides evidence-based recommendations. We are working on the best available knowledge about climate change, and we are translating it in the policy making recommendations. And secondly, we are working at arm's length of government, which means we are a public body, a public organization, publicly funded, but at the same time we are separated from government. And this distance from government gives us some credibility. We are trustworthy observers of climate progress, or not, from climate inertia. The benchmark in our domain is the UK Climate Committee, which has been created in 2008. Is still a reference for good practices in our domain. There is some other initiative around the world. There is, for example, an international climate councils network, which has been created in Glasgow in 2021 at the European level as well. And at the committees, the Quebec committee, we are working for collaborations at the in the French-speaking zone. For example, we have some collaboration with the Haut Conseil pour le Climat in France. And some information specific to our committee in Quebec. It's important to know that it's a permanent body, is enshrined in the Quebec's law. And our mission is only to advise the Quebec Minister for Environment, the minister responsible for the all government, the government-wide integrated governance of the fight against climate change. So in this respect, the scope of our advices is potentially all subjects related to climate change, as for example in transport, industry, or other domains like adaptation. We are active since April 2021, and of course our advices are made public in our website. The membership is mainly academia. We are here today with Annie and Catherine, who are two of the members of this committee. We are currently 10 members for a 3-year mandate. The staff supporting the committee are civil servants who are appointed in respect with the Quebec's Public Service Act. We are currently 4, so Mathieu and I, we are public servants, we are civil servants. So it was some information about who we are, in which context we are working. Now I will give you some information about what we have done as the first advice we published. So in 2021, it was at the request of the minister. We worked on carbon neutrality right before the conference in Glasgow in 2021. This advice is important to know that it is the first step for setting carbon neutrality target. There is not such a target for the time being in Quebec. According to the law, an advice of the committee has to start this process for setting a carbon neutrality target, in general GHG targets in Quebec. So we are still waiting for the process to continue in a public consultation within the Parliament. The first thing we have done in our advice on carbon neutrality was to define what is it, and shortly speaking, we can say that it's a balance between sources and removals. We are far from this situation in the world, generally speaking, which means that we have to work for decarbonization, deeply and fastly decarbonize our economy, especially in historic industrialized countries such as Canada and Quebec. And secondly, we have to maintain, and it's also important in Canada, to maintain and develop our carbon sinks. And third, we have to work already with a changing climate, so to adapt to it. That's a chart for showing the upward trend of emissions in the world. At the global level, we see that we are not on the right track and the emissions are increasing since 1990. And you see, roughly speaking, that we are emitting 40 billion tons of carbon dioxide in the world for the time being. And if you see what is our remaining carbon budget, the orange part in this chart, you see that to stay under the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, we can emit for so on 400 billion tons of CO2, carbon dioxide. So we have 10 years for stay under at this pace to stay under the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit. In Quebec, you have here in the orange what are the observations based on our GHG inventory, and in the gray part what have to be done to reach the net carbon neutrality target in 2050. So it's a steep decrease in a very short period of time, 20 to 30 years. And based once again on our GHG inventory, we see that there is no clear transformation in Quebec in the decrease of the GHG emissions. Two steps for two steps for towards carbon neutrality. So first one, which has been defined, is the 2020 GHG target, which was minus 20% compared to the 1990 level. It has been reached in a very particular year in Quebec because of the lockdown due to the COVID pandemic, of course. And the other point is the effect of the carbon market. This California, some credits have been in California in the United States, and that is reported in the assessment of the attainment of the 2020 GHG target. So overall, we have a minus 26% between 90 level and 2020 level. But we cannot say that it's representative of transition of the decarbonization trajectory. The other step is the 2030 target, which is minus 37.5% compared to a 1990 level. And here in this chart, you see what is the effort to do to reach this 2030 targets. In Quebec, 60% of the reductions are defined and funded, which means thanks to the price signal of the carbon market and the programs and regulations that are implemented, we have only 40% to define yet. It's quite also important because it's only in 7 years that we have to reach this target. And the definition of this 40 remaining percent, the 40% of the effort, of the remaining effort can be subject for further advice of the committee. And this here you see that transport is a priority for reaching the 2030 target. In this here you have the information that 56% of the effort for attaining the 2030 target will come from the transport sector. That information is based on the regulatory impact assessment who followed the publishment of the implementation plan of the policy, of the climate policy in Quebec. I talked a lot about decarbonization, but it's important to also work on our ability to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. We have to maintain and develop carbon sinks. It's very important in Canada because of the presence of two major ecosystems, the boreal forest and the permafrost. These two ecosystems are interrelated. They are in a tipping point, and we have to work to better adapt these ecosystems to a changing climate. This summer is very particular, it's alarming for us. we see that approximately between 24 and 78 percent of the fires, the fires this spring and this summer contributed to the equivalent of 24 to 78% of the global Quebec GHG emissions, and only in 2 months. When we said with the Driver, a study published in 2021, that the contribution of natural climate solutions to carbon neutrality can be around 10% in Canada, we are far from this objective. We are more forest is becoming a source of carbon dioxide, and we may lose the backstops that represent natural climate solutions in our fight against climate change. About adaptation, I will be very short, but it's important to also say that we have to adapt and to enhance our efforts on adaptation. That is certain that we won't be able to adapt beyond a certain level of warming. Here you see in the gray part of this chart the scenario to which we can adapt, and in the orange part the scenario where adaptation will be no longer possible. So we have to work on adaptation and decarbonation at the same time as a common goal. To conclude, I will just say to come back to our policy recommendations about carbon neutrality. We have several recommendations in different sectors, regulations, green taxes, more finance, more green infrastructure, and of course to invest in the diffusion of information and knowledge. As I said, transport is our main priority in Quebec, and at the same time we have to work at the multilateral level. Two of the recommendations of our first advice was to support such multilateral solutions. We, for example, recommended to become part of the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and to support vulnerable countries through multilateral funding. These two recommendations have been implemented by the government prior to the conference in Glasgow. So it was a general presentation for the committee, and thank you for your attention.
Does anybody have questions about the presentation? If not, I'm going to ask Catherine Morancy to please step forward.
So I'm going to present some trends with respect to transportation. Of course, transportation in Quebec is our main issue with respect to GHG emissions. So I will give some facts which are based on the Quebec's inventory on GHG emissions, and then other elements, and I don't think I'll have time to go for the rest. So the main source of data for all the graphs I will show is the Quebec inventory on GHG emissions. You will show some drop for 2020, but we all understand why, because there was a pandemic. And of course, it's all going up right now. And you will see that in the trends with respect to car fleets and the use of car, it will continue growing. So Quebec is the most important GHG emission sector with 42.8%, and this was higher before the pandemic, so it will go back because people stopped traveling for quite some time. The second most important is industries, and the reason why it's like this, and as Annie presented, it's because we have clean energy, so our other sectors are doing much better. So just the source of GHG. So globally, it's CO2, which is the dominant one, and among CO2, you will have the transport sector, which is 54.4% of GHG. If you look at the trends, so the black line is transportation, so it was growing since 1991. We have a small drop. Don't worry, it's going back up. And it's the one which had the highest increase. And I'm saying this because we're pushing hard to have strong policies with respect to transportation, and it's really hard to make them implemented. So when we look into transport, it's road transport, which is the dominant one. You have other transport, and then you have airplanes and maritime, but it's really all about road transport. And other transport includes like the pipeline and things like this. So my research area is really about transportation of people, a bit freight, and these are the two most important ones. When you look at trends, so what happened is that people are buying more large cars, and I will have statistics on this later. And you have the increase also on the freight part. So our next recommendations will be, report will be on freight transport. And we have very interesting recommendations. Hopefully they will be implemented. So maybe just some statistics so we understand what's happening in terms of transportation. So these are statistics for Montreal region. It gathers half of Quebec's population. And I would say that what we're seeing elsewhere is worse. So if it's going badly in Montreal with respect to transportation, we look at other regions and it's worse. So if you look at the car fleet, and I won't use car actually, I would use vehicle because the fleet of vehicle has really transformed over time. So what we're seeing right now is the increase in the number of vehicles in the Montreal area. And actually what I keep repeating every time I have the chance is that the population of vehicles is increasing faster than the population of adults. And that should be a worry for us. And we don't have anywhere in any policy a target to reduce the number of vehicles or to control the transformation of the fleet. So the car industry has never been so well. It's selling cars with a higher profit margin. It's putting a lot of money on advertising, and on the other hand, we don't have enough money to fund our sustainable transportation modes. So if we, it's not in the slides, but if we use the Canada Census, Statistics Canada survey on expenses, we know that the Quebec population is investing $33 billion yearly for private transportation. So it's really about a choice. When you look at the transit authority budget, it's much lower than that. It's 1 point something billion per year, but we collectively, for our car, fuel, maintenance, spend 33 billion, and I think if we took a share of that or invest more wisely into transportation, we could have really good infrastructures. So the next statistics is about the transformation. So this is also something that we discussed, but currently there's no process to change the way the fleet is managed because it's currently not managed. So what we can observe is that in addition to having more vehicles, each vehicles take more space in 2D and 3D. So we've estimated the footprint of vehicles over time. And what we're seeing here is for 2000 to 2019, the length is increasing, the area, so the square meter occupied by a vehicle is increasing, the weight is really increasing, and it's creating issues for some parking infrastructures or even bridges because it was not designed to have such weight. It will become worse because electric vehicles are much heavier, so this issue will increase, and the share of SUVs and vans is increasing. I think it's up more than 40% with what we're observing right now. And not strange, but the ambiguous element is that the fuel consumption has not increased that much because car constructors have developed really eco-efficient cars, but people don't take this opportunity to reduce their consumption of fuel. They're buying larger car. It's like speed. If you go faster, then you allow people to go further. So if you look at the footprint, So you look at the trends with respect to the increase in number of vehicles, but every vehicle is increasing in terms of footprint. So when you look at space consumption in cities, so parking spaces are decreasing because of the increase in the size of cars. Congestion is increasing, so with the same number of vehicles, congestion is increasing just because each car takes more space. And this is the increase in the footprint, 2D and 3D footprint over time. And this will increase, so I don't think we'll see a line, it will increase because what we're selling right now is much larger than what we used to sell in terms of car. And of course, we don't have more people in cars, we have fewer people in cars. So the average car occupancy is decreasing, and it's the lowest during the peaks. It's at 1.12 in Montreal during the peak AM peak hours. So where we would need to be more efficient, we're actually less efficient. And of course, there's a spatial gradient. So that's why when you have these, you hear suburban people come and travel in the CBD, it's actually right. So you're allowed to say this. And they drive car, they have more vehicle kilometers. So on the left is the spatial gradient of kilometers traveled. At the right is the average fuel consumption. So we combine data from the car, those who provide registration. And we see that there's still some higher fuel consumption, and our last estimate was the average fuel consumption in the Montreal area is 10.2 liters per 100 kilometers. So we've estimated some fuel consumption to reach activity location, but because when someone takes a car, you hope, it's like when you take a plane, if you do a 24-hour trip, hopefully you're not doing a 2 hours activity at the end. So it's the same logic at the daily level. So if you go to work, we're trying to estimate how much fuel is spent to go to work, because typically you spend more time when you go to work at the destination than when you go drive someone somewhere or when you go shopping. So we've estimated the number of liters per day that were spent for each types of activity and the increase in the number of liters consumed. So there's a high increase over 10 years on the number of liters we're using to support activities. And when we estimate, so we try to estimate some sort of efficiency, how many liters per hour of activity. So hopefully you would guess more efficiency if you go to work because you spend liters, but then you spend 8 hours. And those types of activities where there was the highest increase in terms of liters per hour of activity is really leisure and shopping. And others, because others, if you look at trends, there's a lot of trips which are made to go drive someone somewhere, to go get someone, and then you have half the trip, which is what I would say empty. So you have a lot of fuel spent for short activity. So I would say the return on investment is really low. And that's not something we're typically examining. So this was 2008, and then when you look at 2018, you see that depending on where you live, so this is the spatial gradient from CBD to the suburbs, it's really increasing. So you spend 1.4 liters per hour of activity, for instance, if you live in the suburb for other purposes. And with the fuel costs, it's actually easier to say, okay, you go shopping for 1 hour, it's a $3 direct or cost, because usually people don't take into account the direct cost. So when fuel price raises, it's easier for people to actually understand, well, I have to pay $3 to shop for 1 hour just for fuel, and they neglect the other costs. But I think that's something that needs to be much more easy to mention when people use their car. And of course, when you look at trends, so this is the Greater Montreal area on the left, this is the city of Montreal. So we still, even with COVID, so I've included the 2021 census, car is still highly dominant. So notwithstanding the policies we have with respect to transportation, there's not much happening in terms of, so when I see our targets, which are so ambitious, and at the same time, you don't control the car fleet, you don't have mileage-based fee, you don't have really parking costs anywhere, fuel is quite cheap, and so the car is still increasing in terms of share. So there's not much which is working right now in terms of policies. And if you look at what we could have done, so we've estimated the energy consumption per day using our survey, not per day, but for daily trips across a year, with, of course, an assumption, because we have a 1 liter diary to do this. So we look at the cars owned by the residents and the number of liters per day and how much tons per year we can estimate only for these trips. And then we just assess, what if those people had bought more efficient cars? So we looked in the surrounding, because there's a mimetism process. If your neighbor buys a big car, F-150, maybe you'll buy one. So we've looked into the neighborhoods, the 10 more efficient cars, and then we suppose these people would have bought these, and we exclude electric cars in this. And you see the reduction are so huge, and we don't even change behaviors. It's just a shift in type of car. So it's really strange that we're not much more aggressive with respect to the car industry, because just by shifting cars, not even asking people to walk, take transit or cycle, just by shifting the type of car, we would reduce GHG by so much. I mean, it's huge. So that's really, I would say, strange, because I don't want to use another word, because that's, for me, it's an easy thing to do. You just tell people, well, you can still drive, and then we will decrease congestion, we have more parking space. So a lot of things we're hearing just by shifting types of cars. So just one thing I wanted to say with respect to electrification. So you know that in Quebec we have very important targets with respect to electrification of buses. And we heard in the opening ceremony the CEO saying, and it's a complex thing, it will require so much energy, and we have to build a new garage, train people for maintenance. It's not now, it's maintenance. And one electric bus will not replace one hybrid or diesel bus, because we still have a range issue. And still since the technology is not really perfect right now, we will need to replace one diesel bus by more than one electric bus. So we need to buy more buses. So of course we need garage and everything. So the targets we have in Quebec is in 2025, every new bus must be electric, or you don't get the subsidy, and it's 40% subsidy. So it's a lot of money, and transit authorities don't have money to subsidize themselves for that. They're not allowed to buy hybrid buses, just electric bus. So what's happening right now is, if buses are not available, they're taking their old diesel bus and increasing the number of years they will operate. In 2030, 55% of the bus in service are electric. So a bus so there's a turnover rate in buses, but currently they don't have access to enough electric bus to do this. So the best cost estimate we have for this is $7.2 billion to reach the 2030 target. And when we estimate the share of GHG emission due to transit in Quebec, it's 0.27% of all GHG. So what I keep saying, that we will have very nice shining electric bus every 2 hours, because we won't have money anymore to operate. So that's a lot of money to do this. And we would definitely have much more gains if we doubled the frequency with the current bus. And when we estimate how many passengers we need in a bus to have the equivalent in terms of every kilometers traveled per passenger in terms of energy requirement or GHG emission, we actually need something like 8 passengers in a regular bus. When it's a hybrid bus, it goes down to 5. So as soon as you put 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 passengers in a hybrid bus, you do much better than a solo driver in a van or a SUV. And that's something I guess we don't understand yet, because if we understand this, we would just increase frequency, make sure that we increase modal shift, and we would have much more impact on GHG emissions. So that's something that we probably, so we didn't write any recommendation yet on personal mobility. But I think there's a lot of things we need to understand to make recommendations that would actually have a quite rapid impact on GHG emissions. So voila, that was I wanted to say about transportation right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Again, I'd like to open the floor for questions if there is any. Feel free to ask any questions to Catherine Morancy.
Might have one, actually.
Yes.
Might be out of scope, but we do have in Quebec good program to kind of insensitive for people to buy electric car, right?
Yes.
Federal and provincial program, right? I think we can get close to 13K, if I'm not mistaken. Could it be a good idea to actually have a program to not own a car? For example, so people who are not buying a car, so it might be out of scope, I know it might be an economy question, but what do you think?
It's not a bad question. So I already answered that this idea was really not a good idea to give collective money to people so they can buy cars. Because the message which is sent is that this is our priority. You have more value if you buy an electric car than if you don't buy a car, or if you travel by bike or walking or using transit, because there is no incentive, no monetary incentive for someone who says, I will live near my job so I can do everything walking. We give $0 to these people. So it's really an ambivalent message. And when we had discussion on this with some people from the government, I said, this is really cognitive dissonance. You're saying stop and shift to other modes, but at the same time you're giving money to people who actually buy cars. And you're also subsidizing the electric recharge stations. And you're taking public space to reserve the space for people who own cars. And if you use a toll bridge, you don't pay, and you have the prime spot in parking lots. I mean, there's a lot of things we're doing that will convince people that are saying, you know, if you have an electric car, you're actually super. And then we saw in the literature that some people were shifting from transit to cars because cars are green. And they were asking for, you know, I don't have to pay because I have a green car. And we also have to remember that there is nothing which is GHG free, so zero emission is not true neither, because it's only true if you cancel the initial footprint that, like you said, I mean, if you don't take into account footprint, I mean, my phone is not zero emission. So it's a really, so I may understand why it's easy to promote such an incentive, but for me it makes no sense.
I actually might add something. Well, it seems to me that you know, this incentives to not own a car, or just trying to educate the public stuff around. You know, you need to maximize your return on investment. When you take your car, you go to somewhere, just don't buy one thing and back, and just maximize your. So it seems that these sorts of things that would be easy gains and obvious from a, you know, from an engineering or from a just rational perspective, is not within the scope of what governments do today, right? So it's kind of it's governments that have to learn to do new things in a way in industry. And so anyway, it's my 2 cents.
Maybe our next report on personal mobility can include stuff like this. Let's see.
So I'd like to ask Annie Levasseur to go on stage.
Go on stage.
Please,
Go on stage.
It's your show. You see the slideshow is on the. Yeah.
Do you hear me? Yeah, you hear me well. I don't have to move the microphone. Yeah. So I will talk about one of our advice that we published. It's basically it's the government was working on a new national policy on architecture and land development. So we really decided to use this opportunity to look at what could be recommendations for them. So as Benoit said, sometimes the government asks us to look at a given topic and give advice, but this time we decided by ourselves, like grown people, to do a report because it was a very good opportunity. So in 2021, the government was working on an overview of the situation, and they made some consultations. So in the first months of 2022, we decided to draft a scientific opinion of the committee, and it included 5 main recommendations and with some more detailed recommendations. And in June 2022, so not very long time after, the government published its first national policy on architecture and land development. And I think in 2023 they published a more detailed document with the main actions. So of course we discussed this since the beginning. So like climate change, it's really urgent to move and to decrease our emissions. And of course, to avoid a mounting loss of life, biodiversity, and infrastructure, ambitious accelerated action is required to adapt to climate change at the same time as making rapid deep cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. This is a citation from the IPCC when they published their last assessment report. And they really talk about both, like as Benoit said, we need to decrease emissions in order to be able to adapt to the remaining temperature increase. And with land use planning, we do both. It's very important for both of these aspects. Because all the choices we made regarding land use planning will have an impact on our ability to first reduce GHG emissions, because we know that land use will condition, of course, territorial density, the structure, the movement of people and goods. And it's something that we really need to think upstream, because it takes a long time, and the impacts will occur several years later. So sometimes we focus, for instance, on the 2030 reduction target, but decisions we take now on land use planning will probably more contribute to the 2050 target. But it's important that we make these choices right now because of this time lag. And as I said, it's really also linked to the adaptation to climate change, because land use condition our relation to the environment, influence the ability to face extreme weather events. And since the last year, like here in Quebec, we already lived many events for which the frequency is going to increase, such as huge storms, that we had one last week. We had a high storm, we had forest fires, as Benoit said. So we really see the importance, because if we don't use appropriately land use planning, then of course nature won't be able to help us, as you said, with the natural climate solutions. And also in urban space, as we see on the picture, also the nature and the land use is very helpful, for instance, to help manage rain and to avoid or decrease heat islands and so on. So it's very important also to be careful about that. I won't talk too much about the trends because Catherine just did a wonderful presentation, but as a summary, since 1990, and I use the 2019 so that we don't see the impact of the pandemic, so it's a little trick. So we increased, unfortunately, the emissions from transport by 60%. This is road transport only, but it's the main part as Catherine showed. So we increased by 60%, and of course the share of the emissions, of the total emissions, also increased, because we did, for instance, with the carbon market, we decreased emissions from the industry, and we decreased the emissions in a few sectors, but transportation is really increasing, so the share also is increasing. When we go, as I said, toward a net zero emission target in 2050, there are many strategies, and this is a hierarchy that is really used by sustainable mobility people. So first, of course, the first thing to do is to avoid travels. So, and land use planning really is very, very important here, because the way we build cities or villages, or the way we plan how we use the land, will have an enormous influence on this part. And then when this is done, of course, we have to shift transportation mode, and Catherine shown a very nice picture about that. So try to go to bike, walking, transit, and so on. And then the last thing to do with the remaining cars or trucks that we have is to improve them, improve efficiency, maybe switch to electricity, and so on. But we should not do the opposite, but unfortunately, it's easier to do the improvement part. But with this advice, we really want to target the first element of this hierarchy. Catherine shown also this picture, so we really see that territorial density conditions transports GHG emissions. As further you are from the city center, you make more kilometers with your car, because everything is further. Maybe you go to work in the city center using your car, because transit is worse when you are further, because density is not there, so you cannot have as good service, and most of the time the stores are like in a corner. It's not mixed with the houses. When you are in more central neighborhoods, usually you have some stores that are very close to the housing and so on, so that you can avoid using your car. So that's something we see, of course, everywhere in North America, and probably elsewhere also in the world. So land use in Quebec, especially, the land use is really planned for cars. It has been since the beginning. So public services and stores are more easily accessible by cars. So of course you cannot blame people to go there by cars, because it's made like that. Distances are long to serve the various functions of a territory. And you will hear a lot of people who are trying to be against these ideas. They will say, well, we don't have choice because things are far, and they are right. I mean, things are far. So we really need to think how to better use the land because of that. Public transportation, of course, is less attractive because there are not enough users to provide a good service, so it's like an infernal loop. We also have here in Quebec very poor train and intercity buses services, and very, very poor. I mean, I try to use them, but it's like a running gag between us when we want to take a train to go to Quebec. There's also a very important thing to understand is about these dynamics that leads to even more unsustainable transport system regarding land use, because of course we hear sometimes that we should increase the area for highways so that we reduce traffic jams, and if we reduce traffic jams it will reduce emissions. Yes, but in fact, you make the car more attractive, and when you make the car more attractive, more people will take it, and then after a few years, the traffic jams will be back, and you have more emissions because you have more cars. And when the cars take more space, then everything else becomes less attractive. When you're on your bike, it's fearful because you say, okay, there are so many cars, so it's becoming less attractive. So all these effects, so in the end, will really lead to an increase in emissions in cars. It's also an increase, of course, in other types of pollutants. We talk a lot about climate change, but all these is related, and security issues. And we talk a lot about this, for instance, in Montreal, since 2 or 3 years, we really see an increase in security for pedestrians and bikes. Actually, we have more accidents, even if they take more space. Also, it's really related, I talk a lot about transport, but it's also related with building emissions. We have to, of course, think about this in a systemic way, because of course, it's less expensive to build on natural lands, so people tend to just put the houses or the infrastructures further. because it's much less expensive. Also, municipalities, they really like that their only way to have revenues is to have taxes on buildings, so they really want to increase their stock of buildings. The average total floor area is also increasing. That's a real important trend that we see. So from 1990 to 2018, we've seen a 72% increase in total floor area per percent. So we have bigger houses. Of course, if we build them further, then it's less expensive, so then we can have bigger houses. So of course this also leads to increases in GHG emissions for the building sector. Direct emissions for the heating and so on, but also we don't think a lot about this when we look at GHG emission inventories, but you also have intrinsic carbon in there, like all the materials that is required to build these houses. Increased energy efficiency in building is not enough to compensate for this increase, because of course we see improvements in terms of energy efficiency, but it's not enough. So overall we increase emissions. Also, it's important to say that appropriate land use planning could facilitate energy efficiency measures, such as central energy loops, circular economy strategies, but we need a kind of density to do that. The energy loop is really to share, for instance, one central heating with many houses, and because you have just one, first you can really increase the efficiency. Like we have one in Montreal, a central heating. It heats a lot of buildings around in downtown, and they are, I mean, very efficient because it's their job just to increase efficiency. And you can also, like there's another one in Montreal in a new neighborhood, and they really benefit from the different types of uses in the buildings. So you have office spaces, you have houses, but houses will consume more, for instance, in the evening, but offices during the day. So when you have a central energy loop, you can really benefit from these interactions. But of course, to do that, you need first that people are quite close, and that this mix of usage are close. But that's also good for transportation. So it's really need to be looked at together. Of course, there are also non-climate change issues related to land use plan for cars. It's very expensive. Catherine said we pay a lot of money for our road infrastructure as a society because the government here pays for everything. It takes a lot of place. I don't know if you've seen in Montreal, but now we have a few pedestrian streets during the summer. And I mean, they are great places, like everybody is in the street, but we lose that when everything is just for cars. It also increases impacts on human health, as I said, associated air pollutants, for instance, potential injuries. It leads to inequity issue also, like young people, vulnerable people might not be able to take cars, so it's we have equity issues. Like there's a 5D potential to moderate travel demand. Of course, the density is very important, the number of inhabitants per square kilometers, the diversity of land use, as I said. We want to avoid dormitory towns, the design of urban spaces to favor walking and biking also, and destination accessibility and the distance to transit. So all this is very important in terms of land use planning. So we made 5 main recommendations. One of them is really focused on transportation, so I'll present all the recommendations in these ones. I'll briefly discuss the others also, but one of the main recommendations was to really prioritize sustainable mobility. So first, to integrate active and public transportation infrastructures in all projects. So it can be, and also people always say, okay, we cannot like use the solutions from very big cities and export them into small villages that we have in Quebec. That's true. Solutions are different, but we can think about ways to include active and public transportation in all these situations, given the different contexts. And also to support regional transport services. As I said, train and intercity buses are so poor, but we think that it's the role of the government to support this instead of supporting, for instance, the construction of a new highway. Just personal opinion. Another recommendation is to develop an integrated assessment mechanisms of interactions between mobility, urbanisms, and transport services, and to put on standby any project leading to an increase in highway capacity while waiting for these mechanisms. So that was a strong recommendation we made. It's not part of they didn't include it in the policy though, but that's something that we tried to make this point that it would be very important when you have a project to increase the capacity in terms of highway, to think about everything that I just shown earlier in the presentation. And not just say, okay, it's going to lead to a decrease in traffic, so that's good. The third one is to act in an exemplary manner regarding the localization of public services to favor multimodal access, optimal regional coverage, consolidation of city and village centers, and the deployment of proximity public services. And since the government, especially in Quebec where everything is public, healthcare, education, and so on, so the government really has the power to really take good decisions and be exemplary when they decide where to build these new hospitals or schools and so on. So and then of course when you show the example, then maybe that others will follow. Very quickly, like all the other recommendations from this document, the first one was to preserve and restore natural lands to store carbon and favor climate change adaptation. As I said, we really need to preserve our nature if we want it to continue to store carbon. So that's very important. So we ask to put targets, and also not just a global target. For instance, like the Quebec territory is huge, but everybody is in the southern part. So of course it's quite easy to preserve nature up north. So if you say you want to preserve 30% of the territory, but not everything up north. So that's easy, and we really need to preserve some nature where people live. That's very, very important because, yes, it stores carbon, but it's also very important for adaptation. We recommend to support the urban consolidation, energy saving, and decarbonation of the built environment, so to promote like this type of projects for energy efficiency of buildings, to share energy loops, circular economy initiatives, and so on. The fourth one was to increase resilience to climate change, to start promoting projects that would include elements of resilience to climate change. And like 2 years ago, we never heard about it. Like some people was talking about it, but in the media, in the general public, we didn't hear about it. Since like 1 year, everybody is talking about it because of all these events that we saw. So that's unfortunate, but at the same time, like people are starting to think about it and to see that it's very important because like the situation will worsen before it improves where we are right now. And finally, the last one is to reinforce the possibilities for taking actions in land use planning to meet challenges emerging from climate change. So for instance, to give municipalities different ways of having revenues so that it's not just building more and further, so that they can find new mechanisms in order to do better land use planning and not just focusing on this increase in area to build the things, and also to like support innovations in like really the role that the government can support and promote this type of initiatives. So thank you very much for if you have any questions.
Any questions?
So I'm not sure it's in your area, but I heard in the news today that one of the suburbs in Montreal is stopping all new construction because of water pressure issues. So the water question is also something that seems to be becoming critical. So we have water, but it feels like when they built their infrastructure at first, the way they forecast demand is not in line with the buildings or what they allow in terms of development.
No, that's true, and climate change is worsening the water availability issues also, because we have more droughts. So they see that now what they have to do, also something that is very important, we keep telling them, is to really change the way we design everything. Because when we design all these infrastructures, of course it's for decades. And right now, if you look at all the codes, the regulations and so on, you don't take into account climate change. But yes, water resources will be affected, and many other aspects also. But yeah, so and now they see it. They see it at some places.
And residents see it. So they call the city saying my pressure is too low. So, but it's like they're the source of the problem at the same time,
Yeah,
which is kind
but
of
you still see many people.
Wait,
They just
they
put
green
water
their grass.
on their
green
on
their
their
grass,
grass.
water
Like,
their grass.
so yeah, we really also for water we are huge water consumers.
Yes.
Like because we
Yes.
have a lot of water.
Yes.
So in our culture we are huge water consumers, huge energy consumers. So there are a lot to do. Thank you.
Right.
So it's Matthew's turn to do his presentation.
Thank you for being here. My name is Mathieu Mondou. I'm working with the committee. I am one of the civil servants working in this committee, so I am not an academic. I facilitate the work of the committee, and therefore I must have this disclaimer. Pardon?
Full screen.
Ah ouais.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So I was saying, therefore, I have this. I must be prudent. Civil servants must be prudent. It's in the law. So my disclaimer is that this report that I'm going to present. So sorry, I didn't start. With the first thing is that I'm going to talk about freight good transportation. So the committee has worked on the movement of goods, specifically heavy goods over a long distance. And we're in the last stages of finishing this report that's going to be transmitted to the minister and then made public. But for the time being, the report is not public. We're showing the report as it is today. And of course, everything that's been discussed here is not officially the government's position. It's this independent committee's position. So first off, what did we look at? We look at freight transportation, so goods, not people. Heavy goods, as I said, and over long distance. Again, off-road transportation, we're talking about mining, forestry is not included in the remit of this report. And, there's many decarbonization options available in this area, but we're really focusing on deep cuts. So, marginal things like more efficiency. Our aerodynamics is not within really what we're looking for. We were asked by the Minister of the Environment of Quebec to delve into the options for really strong cuts. Just a quick statistics. What does heavy freight transportation represent? It's a good tenth of total emissions. So mainly trucking, but also a little bit of train and maritime. So what's the challenge in this area of heavy goods? Well, as the way we wrote in the report, it's tackling a sector that's the freight activity is just raising, and of course that's the main driver of raising GHG emissions. I have a chart next that will show that the trends are pretty strong. But behind this raising activity, you could raise freight activity but not raise GHG emissions. It only happens because we're dependent on this fossil fuel infrastructure and particularly on trucking. Most of the emissions are due to trucking. And this dependency, of course, is embedded in an infrastructure, in institutional context, public infrastructure, private equipment as well. Of course, companies buy trucks. They localize their distribution hubs at certain areas near highways and stuff. So all this is sort of self-reinforcing. Some academics have used the term carbon lock-in, being that you're in this system that's reinforcing. So it's hard to move out of it, but it's not impossible. And of course, decades of weak or strong inaction have made it harder to change. So this is the chart I was mentioning just before. This is percentage change over 2 decades, particularly for heavy freight transportation. As you see, compared to GDP and population, it's really, particularly population, it's really a huge increase. And this again excludes off-road applications, but if we were to include off-road, this red bar would be really longer, even longer than GDP. But we had the scope of the study was not included, but maybe another time. So now, it's not all doom and gloom. In Quebec, we did reduce GHGs. And now, of course, the year of comparison, 2021, is partially COVID affected. Nonetheless, there is a small total GHG reduction. Of course, we have great natural assets, mainly hydroelectric energy in Quebec, that helps for that. What is driving growth in truck freight? Well, mainly consumption, greater growth in consumption of material goods. People are buying more stuff, and they have bigger houses, as we said before, so more stuff to put in it. And of course, the expansion of the road network makes, every kilometer you build, I'm talking to the experts here, I'm not the best expert, but every kilometer you build, it reinforces the system, makes it more flexible, more used, therefore more attractive. And then for shippers, this truck freight is driven by shipping decisions. So which mode do you use? Why do you use trucking? Because it's more flexible. There's more destinations and more frequency as it is right now. But even if it were, there are these rare, odd situations where a business still uses trucking, even though they would gain from it, and yet they default to the trucking. There is sort of this mentality or behavior that's reinforced, and it's not all infrastructure and material, it's also in a way in mentalities. And of course, there's this Amazon Prime effect that's been working in the last decade. Expectations of consumers is rapid delivery, and truck offers that advantage. And cars and motors and internal combustion engines have become more efficient over time. But what happens in Canada? So this chart here is Canada in blue and compared to Germany in orange, and it looks at efficiency gains. So are trucks getting more and more full, or are they more and more empty in a sense? So there's really nice contrast here in between Canada and Germany, and not in favor of Canada. Of course, we don't have the data specifically for Quebec. And this translates in, so that's the loading factor left, and then GHG reductions on the right, which are much smaller than in Germany. So again, the avoid, shift, improve framework is our sort of frame of reflection here, and that's what we use in the report. And I'm going to go over each element here. But first, a word to say that as we observe, government measures and efforts in Quebec, they are mainly situated in the last section here, which ought to be the last one, but it is in Quebec the area where governments have most invested measures to reduce fridge GHG. Now, it is important to say that Quebec is not like the exception here. Most developed countries have the same distribution of measures with regard to this problem. But it is important to say that we have to shift that and change and put much more effort into reducing material transport and shifting, of course. So here are a few policy options that the committee is considering right now, and for the time being. In the avoid tier, of course, there's many different things that can be done. There's material sobriety, just people consuming less goods. But today I'm going to focus more on one aspect, and that's something we're suggesting here is the circular economy. I think the committee feels that a roadmap to develop the circular economy, and he has talked much more about it, but having a roadmap for collectively to develop this capacity would be in the end, it's not direct effect, it's long-term effects, but you have to sort of put in the grooves and build the waterway. I not say not build the road, I said build the train. So it has to, it's in the long run, it's going to favor stuff like less transportation of goods because it's local, it's reuse, and so on and so forth. And in the shift tier, of course, shifting freight from truck to train or barge is, of course, the obvious answer. Modal shift, it's called. And here we have the undeniable, very powerful data that shows it that when you're in the realms of minus 90% GHG with current situation, it's really important. We're not talking about, we're talking about current technology, not like high-tech trains and stuff like that. It's diesel trains, 90% GHG reduction. So, it's the obvious answer, but it's another thing to move it in motion, to set it into motion. So, what we wrote in the report is that the way to get there, there's three items important. So you have to think about social externalities. So a cost to society, injuries, health costs, because of air and so on, and biodiversity loss. So all these have. You can put a money sign on it, and if you consider these costs into the price of shipping costs, then of course the shipping decisions will be more in line with the true, the better way to do stuff, to do things. Of course, there is a lack of information also on carbon of supply chains. So. People buy stuff on Amazon. Typically, we think about people who buy stuff on Amazon, but businesses do business with other businesses. They ship to other businesses, the suppliers and so on. So they extract mining and forestry and so on. So that's also part of of how businesses make decisions. Is you have to know that if they choose XYZ logistic options, that they're creating a bigger carbon footprint. And in a world where the finance is getting more and more interested in sustainability, then this publicity of information of carbon footprint has an importance, and it's gaining more and more importance. The last so to say guideline to the shift option would be I use the word overhaul. It makes it scares people, but it's it's pretty much what has to be done in terms of regulating the sector of rail and maritime sectors. Are basically, the decisions are private decisions, and the cost of carbon and externalities are not taken into account. So, train companies will maximize their profit. That's all. There's no, the public frame of regulation is not taking into account decarbonization objectives yet. In Quebec and in Canada, in 2050, we have to be net zero. So government might need to step in and say something about what these companies are doing and making their decisions. Now, here are examples of shift measures. Of what things that could be done more in a more immediate way that the committee feels it's more could be done. So eco-fiscality, so a per kilometer charge for road freight. I'm saying road freight, putting emphasis that it would be for road freight. And that's based on the fact that there's higher social costs, like social externalities ought to be, in a way, internalized into the prices, as I said. So obviously, you put a price, people react. That would nudge businesses and consumers towards modes that are less carbon intensive, and might have health co-benefits, of course, because shipping stuff on train has less social externalities, for instance, overall. And then the second thing to favor a modal shift that could be done is to implement a rail and maritime strategy and really gear that strategy towards modal shift. Because right now there's initiatives around ports and so on and so forth, but it's really important to think that it's not growing train per se, growing boat freight per se. It's transferring trucks, stuff that is on trucks onto trains. So it's really like we're building energy infrastructure, and in a lot of places of the world you're building air and solar. But if it's only piling on top of other fossil fuel sources, we're not better. It has to replace the others. So it's the same logic here with the shift, with the shifting. Lastly, not least, improve. Of course, there's many potential measures, but I'm going to focus here on the electrification options. So there's this really nice chart that was published by C'est bon. I don't know how to pronounce his name correctly. Anyways, you probably know him already. These are three electrification options. So hydrogen on the left, a battery in the middle, and electric road. So ERS, which stands for electric road systems, that overhaul cable trucks that are connected to the road and have energy directly from the road. So if you take 100 kilowatts and then final usage, the efficiency, you can see 23% for hydrogen, 69% for battery electric, and 77% for electric road system. So, the conclusion is really hydrogen is not that efficient, and that's really important that it is well known when making decisions about a strategy of electrification here. So the committee feels that a few guidelines ought to be put forward to in this transformation that's undergoing right now. It's starting right now. A lot of electric truck companies also that are based in Quebec. You know, there's an industry, there's a nascent industry also. But so the committee feels that we should put emphasis on truck electrification only for shorter distance, and then for long distance, put them on trains. Well, what that means is you need intermodality. You need intermodal centers, and if you plan the charging infrastructure for the trucks, which needs special charging infrastructure that are different from cars, if you put you say goulot d'étranglement, you have to go there to that charging infrastructure. If you plan the charging infrastructure at an intermodal station, then you're sort of putting the seeds for intermodality, for modal shift. So again, planning is key here, and we need to think about that. The last but not least, there's been strong regulatory proposals. Emphasis again the word proposal from California, and also the U.S. federal government to reduce GHG's average emissions of trucks, and feel that the government obviously should not be under this level. So conclusion, my time is over. That's what my cell phone says. Well, heavy freight sector is GHG emissions from this sector is the result of repeated shipping decisions from businesses. And therefore, there is a habitual or behavioral component to this. Obviously, businesses, they seek profit, and so you can't try to induce to do them to do the right thing. You have to build in incentives into the system. So that's one thing. The other thing is that public choices from infrastructure, we've been talking about it since the beginning of this session. Investing into roads is sort of shaping future shipping decisions. So it's really important that today, when the governments make decisions, that they invest in modes that are more efficient, more GHG efficient as well. So that's part of this long, really, really hard process of exiting this carbon lock-in. It's really exiting this negative pattern. The current trajectory is really a lot of activity, rising GHG emissions. So it requires bold action that would orient consumer and businesses' decision towards low carbon options. Thank you very much. I'd like to acknowledge at the end that we did this, we wrote this report as well with the help of the CIRELT, which is one of the organizers that you have right here. CIRELT experts also contributed to the reflection of this report. So thank you for your attention.
Any question for Mathieu?
Yes.
Just a question. Realistic is it to switch to trains in Quebec currently with the current rail network? Because only one track and the train has to wait for many minutes. Can we achieve the 90% with the current rail network?
Of course, nothing's going to it's not going to be overnight that we're going to achieve the 90% reduction. We did ask the question to the train people, to the CN people, and there is space for more shipping and train in what they call the Eastern Division, Quebec, Maritimes, and Ontario. So there is space there that could be used more. Of course, in a long-term perspective, you'd have to ask the expert there if there's another line that's necessary, and the costs are really high to create a new train line and to maintain the existing one as well. And that currently it's borne by private capital right now. So that's part of the equation. But realistically, more stuff could be put on trains tomorrow if behavior would change. But not everything that's on trucks could be. Of course, there's some destinations that are only available, reachable by truck.
When will the report be public?
We're working on a timeline that it would be end of August, right? Unless the minister says we can put it public before.
There is a 30 days lag between the transmission of the report and its publication.
Like that question. Okay, thank you everybody. We have still a bit of time left for Benoit to talk about the next steps, next reports of the committee.
Is there any general questions about this, or the presentation, or the full presentation first? No, it's okay. So thank you for being here today. The next steps for the committee will be several advices. The first one will be about carbon market. The government has the will to change some aspects of the carbon market, and the minister asked us to do an advice on this matter. And another topic, so that is the first one. The other topic will be about the monitoring of climate actions in Quebec. It will be due before the next conference, climate conference in Qatar. Again, in this fall, like the advice for the carbon market, about the carbon market. And a third advice will be done later this winter about new buildings and the decarbonization, also adaptations about new buildings in Quebec. Other topics can be climate finance, and agriculture, the decarbonization and adaptation within the agriculture sector. And of course, maybe we will work on the transportation
Of people.
a topic, very important topic for Quebec. That is the plan for almost next year for the committee. And thank you for being here, and see you soon. Bye.